The chapel clock read 4:45 p.m. as Pastor Thomas closed his well-worn Bible, his calloused hands unconsciously brushing against its gilded pages. His weary eyes scanned the small sanctuary where he had just completed 3 consecutive services, followed by hours of pastoral counseling. Sweat marked his simple white shirt, a silent reminder of the sweltering summer afternoon. His phone vibrated, a message from his eldest son reminding him about the flight. "Dad, don't be late. It's the last flight to Chicago today." Thomas glanced at his wrinkled clothes and sighed. There would be no time to change before heading to his son's medical school graduation. The choice between attending to one last family in crisis or maintaining a polished appearance was never really a choice, not in his 25 years of ministry. The last family had just left, the mother's eyes still glistening with gratitude after Thomas spent 2 hours helping her teenage son navigate suicidal thoughts. Some battles could not wait for pressed clothes or socially acceptable appearances. As he hurried to the airport in his modest 15-year-old Corolla, Thomas reflected on how his life had transformed since taking over the small neighborhood church. The once abandoned sanctuary now overflowed, not with material wealth, but with stories of lives forever changed. Every scuff on his worn-out shoes told a story of miles traveled to visit the sick. Every crease in his simple shirt marked countless hours spent beside broken-hearted individuals. The airport parking lot was full, forcing him to leave his car in the farthest spot. Thomas jogged through the air-conditioned corridors, carrying only a small carry-on bag that held his lone tie and a carefully folded suit for the graduation ceremony. His first-class tickets had been a surprise gift from his congregation, a token of love that still moved him deeply whenever he thought about it. At the boarding gate, Thomas noticed the curious, and occasionally disdainful, glances from other first-class passengers. His plain white shirt and basic slacks contrasted starkly with the impeccable suits and designer dresses around him. Even so, he carried himself with quiet dignity. Years of experience had taught him that true nobility comes from character, not clothing. As boarding began, Thomas waited patiently for his turn, absorbed in silent prayers for the faces he saw around him, a habit he had developed over the years. When he finally stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant greeted him with a faintly forced smile, her eyes betraying a mix of confusion and judgment as she scanned his first-class ticket. He then found his seat, 4D, occupied by a woman elegantly dressed, typing furiously on her latest model smartphone. Her Chanel ensemble and gleaming jewelry stood in stark contrast to Thomas's simple attire. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, "I believe this is my seat." Catherine Morrison glanced up from her phone, her gaze sweeping over Thomas from head to toe with barely concealed disdain. Her perfectly painted lips curled into a cold smile as she replied, "There must be some mistake. This is clearly a first-class seat." The aisle began to clog with other passengers trying to reach their places. Remaining calm as ever, Thomas gently presented his boarding pass. "Yes, ma'am. I have a ticket for first class, seat 4D. Catherine let out a laugh, artificial and sharp, drawing even more attention. "Oh, please. Someone with your appearance clearly doesn't belong in first class. There must have been an error at check-in." Her comment sliced through the air like a razor, and the ensuing silence was deafening. Passengers paused to watch the scene unfold, some smirking, others averting their gaze in embarrassment. Thomas felt the weight of every glance, every whisper, every muffled chuckle. An executive seated in the row across the aisle chimed in, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable finding your seat in economy, where you obviously belong." Thomas's face burned, not with anger, but with a profound sadness for the hardness of the hearts around him. Over his years in ministry, he had faced prejudice and ridicule before, but something about this moment felt especially cruel. Perhaps because it happened just as he was on his way to one of the most significant milestones in his son's life. The flight attendant approached, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sir, is there a problem?" Before Thomas could respond, Catherine interjected. "Yes, this individual is insisting that he has a ticket for first class. There must obviously be some mistake." Thomas held his boarding pass with slightly trembling hands, not from fear, but from a contained emotion that threatened to spill over. His thoughts turned to his son, to the pride he felt for his achievement, to the sacrifice his congregation had made to gift him that ticket. How could he explain that this seat represented not just a place on a plane, but the love of an entire community? The tension in the aisle increased with every passing second. Thomas felt the weight of the memories from that morning, the anxious face of the mother who had sought him out in desperation, fearing she might lose her son to depression. He recalled the moment he decided to postpone changing clothes to assist that last family in need. Now, facing the disdainful stares, he wondered if he had made the right decision. "Sir," the flight attendant intervened again, her voice betraying a slight tremor of discomfort, "may I check your ticket?" Thomas handed over his boarding pass with steady hands, years of practice in maintaining composure during difficult situations evident in his controlled gesture. The attendant examined the document, her eyes widening slightly as she confirmed the validity of the ticket. "Ms. Morrison," she addressed Catherine, "he is correct. This is indeed seat 4D. Catherine straightened in her seat, her face a mask of indignation. "This is ridiculous. There must have been a mistake in the system. Just look at him." Her voice rose a few decibels, drawing even more attention. "How can someone dressed like that be in first class?" The aisle was now completely congested. Impatient passengers began to complain, some discreetly filming the scene with their phones. Thomas felt the weight of each stare, each silent judgment, each moment of scrutiny. In that instant, his mind drifted back to pivotal moments in his journey. The decision to leave a promising corporate career to serve a struggling small congregation. The day he sold his new car to help a church family facing eviction. The sleepless nights by hospital beds, holding the hands of church members in their final moments. When his congregation learned of his son's graduation, they had secretly mobilized. For weeks they organized events, sold cakes, saved what they could. The first-class ticket was the result of the love and sacrifice of simple people who wanted to honor their pastor. "I can sit somewhere else," Thomas finally said, his voice calm and carrying a dignity that contrasted with the hostility surrounding him. "There's no need to." "No?" A firm voice cut through the air. An elderly man with gray hair stood up a few rows ahead. "I recognize this man." Silence took over the cabin as Michael Anderson, a respected local doctor, approached. His normally stern face was marked by a contained emotion. "This is Pastor Thomas," Michael continued, his voice heavy with respect. "The man who spent 5 straight nights in the hospital with my wife during her battle with cancer when I was stuck at a medical conference across the country. The man who organizes the food distribution for needy families every weekend. The man who turned a dying church into a beacon of hope for our community." Catherine blinked quickly, her face losing some of its color. Other passengers began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "In fact," Michael continued, "I would love to swap seats with you if that would resolve the situation. It would be an honor to give up my front row seat for Pastor Thomas." The offer hung in the air for a few seconds. Thomas felt his eyes well up, not with sadness or humiliation, but with gratitude for the way God turned moments of trial into testimonies of grace. Catherine finally stood up, her movements stiff, betraying her discomfort. "It won't be necessary," she murmured, gathering her designer purse. I can sit somewhere else." As she moved to take another seat, Thomas gently touched her arm. "Ma'am," he said softly, "thank you. Sometimes, God uses our most uncomfortable moments to teach us the most valuable lessons." The other passengers began settling in, the previous murmur replaced by a thoughtful silence. Thomas sat down, his mind returning to his son and the graduation awaiting him. In his briefcase, alongside the carefully folded suit, was a small handmade card from one of the children at church. The drawing depicted a simple figure in a suit, with the words, "Our pastor is a hero," written in childish handwriting. As the plane began preparing for takeoff, Thomas closed his eyes in a quiet prayer of gratitude. Behind him, he could hear Catherine sniffing discreetly, and his heart filled with compassion. After all, his mission had always been the same, to show love, especially to those who needed it most. The plane took off smoothly, leaving Chicago behind. Thomas kept his eyes closed, his hands resting on the worn Bible he carried. The first-class cabin had fallen into a contemplative silence after the incident, as if all the passengers were processing what they had just witnessed. Catherine, now sitting a few rows back, couldn't stop thinking about the kind look the pastor had given her. In her 30 years as an executive at a large corporation, she had learned to judge people by their appearance, their status, their connections. But something about the silent dignity of that man deeply disturbed her. A flight attendant approached Thomas, carrying a tray with water and a small snack. "Pastor," she whispered, "I'm so sorry for the previous embarrassment. My grandmother used to say that angels sometimes appear dressed as ordinary people." Thomas smiled, accepting the glass of water. "No need to apologize. Sometimes, God uses our toughest moments to touch hearts that we otherwise wouldn't reach." In the seat next to him, Michael Anderson watched the pastor discreetly. His memories drifted back to those nights in the hospital, when his wife Sarah was battling aggressive cancer. He remembered how he'd find Pastor Thomas sleeping in an uncomfortable chair by her bedside whenever he returned from his long shifts. "Pastor," Michael finally said, his voice low to avoid drawing attention, "I never had the chance to properly thank you for everything you did for Sarah. You know, she still keeps that little prayer card you wrote for her." Thomas turned to Michael, his eyes reflecting deep compassion. "How is she?" "She's been in remission for 2 years," Michael replied, his voice choked with emotion. "The doctors say it was a miracle. But Sarah, she always says the real miracle was finding faith and hope through your example of dedication." A few rows ahead, a young executive who had witnessed the entire boarding scene was typing furiously on his laptop. Instead of preparing the financial reports he should have been working on, he found himself writing a long email to his mother, an ordinary woman he hadn't seen in over a year, always with the excuse of being too busy with his career. The chief flight attendant, Jennifer, approached Catherine discreetly. "Ma'am, I noticed you seem a bit disturbed. Can I bring you something to help you feel more comfortable?" Catherine looked up, surprised by the kindness after her previous behavior. "No, thank you," she replied softly, her voice betraying a vulnerability that didn't match her imposing appearance. I don't know how I acted that way." Jennifer sat in the empty seat next to Catherine, momentarily breaking protocol. "You know," she began, "I've worked this route for 15 years. I've seen all kinds of people pass through these seats. But I've learned that appearances rarely tell the full story." Catherine took a tissue from her designer purse, discreetly wiping away a tear that stubbornly threatened to fall. "When I was a child," she whispered, "my father was a pastor of a small church in the countryside. He wore simple clothes like his. But after we lost everything in a tragedy, I promised myself I would never live in simplicity again. I built a fortress of appearances, of status." The plane passed through an area of light turbulence, making passengers adjust in their seats. Thomas took the moment to pull his Bible from his bag, his fingers automatically finding the bookmarked page, Psalm 23, underlined in his son's delicate handwriting. The turbulence increased, causing some moments of anxiety among the passengers. Catherine, still talking with Jennifer, gripped the arms of her seat. Her fear of flying, carefully masked by years of executive travel, began to show. Thomas noticed Catherine's discomfort. With a gentle movement, he stood up and walked over to her, ignoring the fasten seatbelt sign. "Ma'am," he said kindly, "may I sit here for a moment?" Catherine nodded, surprised by her own vulnerability in front of the man who had publicly humbled her just moments before. Thomas sat down, his presence bringing an inexplicable calm to the atmosphere. "When my son was little," he began, his soft voice blending with the hum of the engines, "he was very afraid of storms. You know what helped him? Holding someone's hand and telling stories. Stories remind us that we're not alone in our battles." As the plane continued its journey through the turbulence, Thomas shared with Catherine the story of his own journey, not one of material success but of spiritual wealth. He spoke about his congregation, about transformed lives, about his son who was graduating in medicine. "He chose medicine," Thomas explained, pride in his eyes, "because he grew up seeing that true wealth lies in being able to help others. You know, Catherine, may I call you that? Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as moments of humility." The turbulence began to subside, but something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. The passengers who had once witnessed the confrontation now observed a different scene. Two people, seemingly so different, sharing a moment of genuine human connection. Michael Anderson, watching the scene, picked up his phone and started typing a message to his wife. "Sarah, remember when you said God works in mysterious ways? Today I understood exactly what you meant." The rest of the flight unfolded in a transformed atmosphere. The invisible barriers separating first-class passengers began to dissolve. A businessman offered his newspaper to another passenger. A lady shared chocolates with the flight attendant. Small gestures of kindness began to bloom, as if Thomas's example had awakened something dormant in each of them. Catherine spent the remainder of the flight in reflective silence, her hand still holding the handkerchief that Thomas had gently offered her during the turbulence. In her mind, long-suppressed memories from her childhood in the parsonage began to resurface. The laughter of the church children, the smell of coffee after the services, the sense of belonging that she had traded for social status. The plane began its descent into Chicago as the afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Catherine held between her well-manicured fingers a simple photograph, slightly crumpled at the edges, the kind of memento that people like her would usually keep in expensive frames or digital albums. In the picture, taken with a modest camera, Thomas's son wore a white coat, his radiant smile lighting up the simple hallway of a public hospital. David chose to work in the most underserved section of the municipal hospital, Thomas explained, his gentle face marked by a different kind of pride, not the kind Catherine knew from corporate dinners, but something deeper, more genuine. He told me that every person he helps is a way to multiply the blessings we've received over the years. Catherine touched the photograph with surprising tenderness, as if afraid that the moment captured there might unravel beneath her fingers. Her nails, painted in a subtle shade of pink by Chicago's most exclusive manicurist, seemed strangely out of place against the common photographic paper. My father, she began, her voice finding a tone she hadn't used in decades, also believed that our true wealth was in what we could offer to others. He used to say that a generous heart is never empty. The sound of her own voice sharing this memory surprised her. It was like opening a long-locked door, letting in light that illuminated forgotten corners of her soul. It had been 30 years since she spoke of Robert Morrison, the devoted pastor who had turned a small country church into a beacon of hope for his community. The church was in a valley, Catherine continued, the words flowing like a river after the spring thaw. It was a simple building with windows that let in the morning light during the services. On Sundays, the smell of coffee made by Mrs. Thompson would mix with the fragrance of the flowers my mom grew in the church's garden. Jennifer, the flight attendant, sat quietly in the nearby seat, her service notebook forgotten in her lap. There was something magnetic about the vulnerability of this woman who, just hours earlier, radiated only arrogance and superiority. That night, Catherine continued, her hands now trembling slightly, I was angry. So angry. The fire started in the church kitchen during a charity dinner. Dad went back to help Mrs. Thompson, who had trouble walking. Her voice faltered for the first time, they didn't make it out. Thomas gently covered Catherine's trembling hands with his, calloused from years of hands-on work at the church. The contrast between their hands, hers pampered in luxury spas, his marked by honest labor, seemed to symbolize the entire chasm she had built between her present and her past. After the funeral, she continued, I promised myself I would never be vulnerable like that again. I swapped simple dresses for branded clothes, replaced hymns with corporate reports. I built a fortress of success and status, believing that it would fill the void. Michael Anderson, from his nearby seat, listened with an attention that went beyond mere medical curiosity. As a renowned surgeon, how many times had he hidden behind his own fortress of titles and accomplishments? How many patients had he kept at arm's length, fearing that emotional closeness would compromise his professional efficiency? But the price, Catherine whispered, her gaze lost in the clouds beyond the window, was my own humanity. When I saw you today, Thomas, with your simple clothes and worn Bible, it was like seeing my father again. And that terrified me. Because for 30 years I tried to bury that girl who sang in the church choir, who helped serve soup to the needy, who believed that love was more valuable than any bank account. The young executive a few rows ahead had finally finished his email. His hands trembled over the keyboard as he typed the last words. Mom, I'm sorry I let success convince me I didn't have time for Sunday family days. I'll be there next weekend. Can we make that cinnamon cake like we used to? Aqui esta a tragiceo para o Ingles, preservando a profundidade emotional e o tom de cada persona gem. Catherine, Thomas spoke with a softness that seemed to envelop the entire cabin. Sometimes our greatest wounds become portals to our deepest healing. Your father didn't leave in vain. Every life he touched, every seed of kindness he planted, continues to grow. Even in you. A slight turbulence shook the plane, making the passengers adjust in their seats. Catherine instinctively gripped the armrest of her seat, but this time it wasn't just the fear of flying that made her tremble. How can I recover so much lost time? She asked, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of regret. How can I honor his legacy after having spent so much time denying everything he stood for? By starting now, Thomas answered simply. Every breath is a new chance. Every moment is an opportunity for reconnection. Jennifer, who had remained silent, absorbing every word, finally spoke. You know, Mrs. Morrison, in 15 years serving on these flights, I've learned to read people. I've seen countless executives, celebrities, important people. But today I saw something different. I saw walls crumbling, I saw hearts opening. The captain announced the beginning of the final descent into Chicago. Catherine looked out the window, seeing the city lights she had long called home, but had never truly felt at home in. Her hands found the small gold cross she always carried hidden under her silk blouses, the last gift from her father. Pastor Thomas, she called, her voice finding a new strength in its vulnerability, I would like Would it be possible? Our church is on Oak Street, number 247, Thomas replied to the silent request. Sundays at 10 a.m. But you know, Catherine, God isn't confined to times or protocols. The doors are always open to hearts seeking reconciliation. Michael Anderson adjusted his silk tie, an automatic gesture that now seemed strangely superficial. Actually, he gently interjected, Sarah, my wife, leads a group on Wednesday nights. They're people like you, Catherine. People rediscovering their roots, reconnecting with parts of themselves they thought they'd lost. Aqui esta a tragicao em Ingles, mantendo a profundidade emotional e a suavidade do texto. Catherine nodded, unshed tears shining in her carefully made-up eyes. On her wrist, the Cartier watch read 7:42 p.m., the exact moment when a life built on appearances began to make way for something more authentic, more true. Maybe, she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, maybe it's time to go home. The Chicago airport terminal pulsed with its usual nighttime energy, artificial lights casting long shadows on the polished marble floor. The passengers from Flight 275 emerged through the gate transformed by the shared experience. The distant, superior gazes had been replaced by kind smiles and mutual nods of recognition. Catherine Morrison held her Hermes bag with an uncommon delicacy, as if the weight of 3 decades of carefully constructed defenses began to dissipate. By her side, Pastor Thomas walked in silence, his calm presence a constant reminder of the truths she had buried for so long. "Can I offer you a ride, Pastor?" Catherine asked, her voice finding a softness that surprised her. The authoritative tone that commanded boardrooms had disappeared. "My driver is waiting and it would be a privilege." Thomas smiled with that gentleness that seemed to reach his tired eyes. "Thank you, Catherine, but I need to take a taxi to the bus station. My son is graduating tomorrow in Boston, and I can't miss the night bus." The mention of the night bus stirred something deep within Catherine, a memory she had kept hidden in some dark corner of her mind. Her father, Robert Morrison, used to make these long trips to visit sick members of the congregation. "True love," he used to say, "knows no distance or time." Boston? Her well-manicured fingers traced invisible numbers in the air. "That's more than 15 hours of travel. And after everything that happened today, you must be exhausted." "Sometimes the longest paths take us exactly where we need to be," Thomas replied, adjusting his small, battered suitcase. "Every mile is an opportunity to touch another life." Michael Anderson, who was walking nearby holding his Italian leather briefcase, interrupted the conversation. The renowned doctor seemed different. His usually stiff posture had softened, as if the past few hours had melted away a layer of formality. "Pastor, I can't let you make this bus trip," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "Let me buy you a plane ticket. It's the least I can do after everything you've done for Sarah during those endless nights at the hospital." Thomas shook his head gently. "Your kindness touches me, Dr. Anderson, but I've learned that our limitations are fertile ground for miracles. On a bus, we meet stories that need to be heard, hearts that need comforting." It was in that moment that something inside Catherine completely broke, the last wall of pride she had built over the years. The tears she had held back during the flight now flowed freely down her face, leaving trails in her expensive makeup. "Please," she pleaded, her voice choking. "Let me do this. Not out of charity but as a first step back home. Back to who I really am." The airport terminal seemed to fall silent as if time itself paused. Jennifer, the flight attendant who had been following them, watched the scene with teary eyes, forgetting the notepad in her hands. "Your father would be proud, Catherine," Thomas said softly. "Robert always said that a person's true character is revealed not by what they have, but by what they are willing to give." Catherine's face turned pale. How do you know my father's name?" Thomas smiled, a smile that carried decades of memories. "Your father was the man who changed my life 30 years ago. I was a lost young seminarian when I attended his lecture on community ministry. I was about to give up on my calling, thinking I wasn't strong enough. But Robert? He saw something in me that I couldn't even see in myself." "He used to do that," Catherine whispered, her hands trembling. "See the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." The young executive who had sent the email to her mother approached, still holding his phone like an anchor. "My mom just told me something amazing," he said, his voice soft. "Our family used to attend your church, Pastor Morrison. I was very young, but she never forgot how your father helped us when we were alone. He found my mom a job, made sure we had food on the table." Catherine felt the world spin. Michael Anderson quickly brought over a chair, and she sat down, decades of suppressed memories emerging like a wave. For 30 years I tried to bury all of this. I built a life of appearances, thinking status would fill the emptiness left by the fire. But today God used my own arrogance to bring me back to the beginning. Thomas opened his worn Bible, its pages marked by years of love and use. There's a passage your father always quoted in moments of transformation. Do you remember it? "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," Catherine recited, the words flowing naturally after so many years. A group of passengers had gathered around them, drawn to the unusual scene. An elderly lady approached timidly. "Sorry to interrupt, but I also knew Pastor Robert. He performed my wedding 40 years ago. When my husband passed away 2 years later, he was the one who helped me find the strength to go on." Stories began to emerge, one after another. A businessman recalled how Robert Morrison had visited his father in the hospital every day for 6 months. A young mother shared how her own mother had found hope in Robert's church during a deep depression. Catherine listened to each story as if they were drops of rain in a desert, each one bringing life back to a long-dried part of her soul. Her father hadn't died in that fire. His legacy lived on in every life he had touched, in every seed of kindness he had planted. "I can't let you take that bus trip, Pastor Thomas," she said finally, wiping away the tears. "Not just out of gratitude but because I need to see with my own eyes the fruit of a life dedicated to what truly matters. Your son, graduating in medicine to serve the needy, is the kind of story my father would have loved to witness." Jennifer smiled, remembering her grandmother's words about how God works in mysterious ways. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we need to completely lose ourselves to find the way back home." Catherine stood up, a new determination in her eyes. "Before we go, I need to make a few calls. First, to cancel all my meetings for the week. And then," she took a deep breath, "to the board of my father's old church. It's time to rebuild not just a building but an entire legacy." As Catherine moved away to make her calls, Thomas watched how her stride, still elegant, now carried a different kind of dignity. Michael Anderson placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know, Pastor," he said quietly, "when Sarah was in the hospital, she always said that sometimes we need to go through storms to learn to dance in the rain." The young executive put his phone away, a serene smile on his face. "I think we're all, in some way, finding our way back today. Back to what truly matters." The night settled over Chicago, and inside the airport, an unlikely group of people discovered that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with a simple act of humility, and that a person's true worth was never in the clothes they wore, but in the heart that beat beneath them. The night flight to Boston carried a different atmosphere from the previous journey. In first class, Catherine Morrison settled into the seat next to Pastor Thomas, her hands trembling slightly as she held a small, faded photo album. For 30 years, this album had remained hidden in her designer bag, like a secret too heavy to face alone. "I found this in the company vault last week," she said softly, her fingers tracing the worn cover of the album. "I couldn't leave it there, but I also didn't have the courage to open it. It's funny how we build fortresses of success to hide from our own memories." Thomas gazed at the small album with tenderness. On the cover, in faded, elegant handwriting, read, "Church of Hope, Precious Moments." Jennifer, the flight attendant who had changed her flight to accompany them to Boston, sat in the empty seat across the aisle, drawn to this story of redemption unfolding before her eyes. "You know," Catherine continued, her voice low and vulnerable, "I spent 3 decades building skyscrapers, signing million-dollar contracts, running rooms full of executives. But never, not for a moment, could I fill the void left by that little wooden church." With trembling hands she opened the album. The first photograph showed her father, Pastor Robert, standing in front of the church. His arm was around a young Catherine, no older than 16. Her smile was radiant as she held a Bible close to her chest, her eyes shining with dreams not yet shattered by the tragedy that was to come. "This was the day I decided to follow in his footsteps," Catherine whispered, silent tears marking her perfectly made-up face. "I wanted to be like my father, touch lives, make a difference in the world. But after the fire, after losing everything, I chose another path. I traded the Bible for spreadsheets, replaced hymns with quarterly reports." Thomas gently touched the photograph. "Catherine, sometimes we have to lose ourselves completely to find our true purpose. Your father used to say that God writes straight with crooked lines. Maybe your journey in the corporate world wasn't just an escape, it might have been preparation." Page after page, the album revealed a story of love and community service. There were photos of food distribution, hospital visits, community celebrations. In every picture, Pastor Robert's smile illuminated the room, and the young Catherine was always there, learning, growing, dreaming. Jennifer pointed to one particularly touching photograph, where dozens of people formed a human chain, passing building materials hand by hand. What was happening here? A soft smile illuminated Catherine's face. It was the church expansion project. We couldn't afford to hire a construction company, so the entire community came together. There was everything in that chain: bricklayers, teachers, doctors, housewives. All united, building something bigger than themselves. The real church was never the building, was it? Thomas gently observed. It was this chain of love, these hands joined together, these hearts beating in sync for the common good. Dad always said that, Catherine replied, turning another page. But I forgot. Or maybe I chose to forget. I traded this true wealth for vaults full of money and boardrooms empty of meaning. A soft turbulence shook the plane, causing Catherine to press the album against her chest. Thomas, sensing her discomfort, began to share a story. When my son David was in his second year of medical school, he almost gave up, he said softly. The overnight shifts were exhausting, the cases difficult, the pressure overwhelming. But one patient changed everything, a frail elderly woman in the public hospital. Catherine and Jennifer turned toward him, absorbed in the unfolding story. She had no one in the world, Thomas continued, fighting alone against terminal cancer. David began spending his breaks with her, listening to her stories, sharing small moments of humanity. On the day she passed, she left him a letter that would change his life forever. Thomas paused, his eyes misting with the memory. The letter said, "Young doctor, you gave me more than medicine, you gave me dignity. Never give up. The world needs hearts like yours." That day, David understood that medicine wasn't just about curing bodies, but about touching souls. Catherine looked again at the photograph of the human chain. "Just like my father tried to teach me," she said softly, "that our true calling is to be a channel of love, not a receptacle for riches." Turning another page of the album, Catherine suddenly stopped, her breath caught in her throat. There was a photo she had never seen before, her father sitting in his simple office, writing in a brown leather journal. "This journal," she whispered. "I never knew what happened to it after the fire. Dad wrote in it every day, but he never let us read it. He said it was a gift for the future." Thomas gently touched her arm. "Catherine, there's something I need to tell you. The night of the fire, your father managed to save two things before the flames took everything: Mrs. Thompson and a package wrapped in waterproof cloth." Catherine's heart stopped for a moment. "How do you know that?" "Because I was there," Thomas answered softly. "I was a young seminary student visiting that afternoon to learn about community ministry. Your father found me in the parking lot, coughing from the smoke. He handed me the package and said, 'Keep this. One day my Katie will need it more than ever.'" The tears now flowed freely down Catherine's face, and Jennifer silently offered another tissue. "For 30 years I kept that package hidden," Thomas continued, "waiting for the right moment, praying that God would show me when and how. Today, when I saw you on that first flight, with all your armor of success and loneliness, I knew the moment had come." "The journal?" Catherine could barely form the words. "You have my father's journal?" Thomas nodded, reaching for his small carry-on bag. From it, he pulled out a package wrapped in faded but still waterproof fabric. With gentle hands, he began to unwrap it. "Your father wrote here every day, Catherine. About you, about his dreams for your future, about his love for the church and the community. In the last pages," he hesitated for a moment, "he wrote about a feeling he had, how he felt that something significant was about to happen. His last words were a prayer for you." The journal was there, its brown cover still preserved by the protective fabric. Catherine touched it reverently, as if it were the most precious object in the world. "In a sense it was. He knew," she whispered. "Somehow he knew I would get lost. And he prepared a way back home for me." Jennifer, watching the scene with tears in her eyes, thought about how her grandmother always said there were no coincidences, only divinely orchestrated encounters. As a flight attendant for 15 years, she had witnessed countless stories unfolding in the skies, but never one as deeply transformative as this. "Catherine," Thomas said softly, "your father wrote something special on the first page. I think it's time for you to read it." With trembling hands, Catherine opened the journal. On the first page, her father's familiar handwriting danced before her eyes. "My dear Katie, if you are reading this, it means the time has come for you to remember who you truly are. Not the successful executive you may have become, but the pure-hearted girl who dreamed of changing the world through love. Fire can destroy buildings, but it cannot burn true love. And you, my daughter, are made of that love. With all my heart. That." The plane continued its journey through the starry night, while 3 lives intertwined by a divine purpose, shared a moment of profound transformation. There, miles above the earth, a prodigal daughter found her way back home through the words of love from a father who had never stopped believing in her purest dreams. Boston Airport welcomed the first rays of sunlight as the flight landed in the early hours of the morning. Catherine held her father's journal against her chest, its pages preserving 3 decades of love and wisdom she had spent so long trying to forget. Beside her, Pastor Thomas adjusted his small bag, carrying not just simple belongings, but the weight of a promise finally fulfilled. "The graduation ceremony starts at 2 in the afternoon, Thomas said softly, glancing at his simple watch. "We have a few hours to rest and prepare." Jennifer, still in her flight attendant uniform, had become an inseparable part of this journey of transformation. "I know a quiet cafe nearby," she suggested. "We could have breakfast while Catherine continues her reading." The cafe was a cozy place with old wooden tables and the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air. The soft morning light filtered through the large windows, casting golden shadows on the wooden floor. The 3 settled in a quiet corner, away from the growing bustle of the street. Catherine carefully opened the journal, her hands still trembling slightly as she touched the pages yellowed by time. "Dad had this habit," she shared, her voice low and full of memories. "He would wake up before sunrise and I would find him in the kitchen, writing in this journal while drinking his coffee. I always wanted to know what he was writing so carefully, but he used to say that one day I would understand." The pages revealed much more than simple daily records. They were fragments of a life devoted to love and service. Robert Morrison had documented not only events but also his deepest hopes, silent fears, and constant prayers for the daughter he knew would one day need to find her own way back home. March 12, 1993, Catherine began to read, her voice trembling with contained emotion. Today Katie turned 16. She organized a birthday party for the children at the orphanage all by herself. Her eyes sparkled as she handed out slices of cake she baked herself. "Seeing her heart so open to love fills me with hope for the future. But it also worries me. The world can be cruel to pure hearts. I pray she never loses this capacity to love, even when life tests her faith." Thomas watched Catherine with kindness, while Jennifer discreetly wiped away her own tears. A waitress brought steaming coffee in simple ceramic cups, the rich aroma filling the space between them. "Keep reading," Thomas gently encouraged. "Each page is a step on the path your father prepared for you to return." Catherine turned a few more pages, stopping at an entry that made her heart tighten. July 15, 1993. "Something feels different at the church. The smell of smoke lingers even when there's nothing burning. The children in the daycare talk about strange noises at night. The firefighters did a thorough inspection today but found nothing unusual. Maybe it's just my imagination, but I can't shake this feeling that keeps me awake. Katie has so many dreams, so many plans to continue our work here. I need to ensure she's prepared for whatever path God chooses, even if it's different from what she envisions now." Jennifer gently touched Catherine's hand. "He was trying to protect you, even without knowing exactly from what. Sometimes a father's love sees beyond the present. Acqui esta o texto traducido como spacamento. But I didn't understand at the time," Catherine whispered, regret coloring her voice. "When the fire took everything, I blamed God, I blamed our simple life, I blamed my father's choice to serve a poor community. I built walls so high around myself that I forgot what it felt like to feel, to truly love." Thomas took out his own worn Bible, opening it to a specific page. "Your father gave me this Bible along with the journal that last night. He said one day I'd understand why. On the last page he left a message I've kept all these years." Catherine leaned in to read the handwritten words on the final page. "To young Thomas, keep these words along with the journal. One day when my Katie is ready to come home you'll know. True love is never lost. It only waits for the right moment to bloom again. Like a seed buried in winter, it needs the darkness to find its strength." The coffee cooled in their cups as Catherine continued reading, uncovering page after page of her father's unconditional love. There were detailed entries about her small achievements at school, her moments of doubt during adolescence, and her first experiences helping at the church. But it was one specific entry that made her heart stop completely. September 23, 1993, last entry. "The smell of smoke is stronger today, impossible to ignore. I've moved all the important documents to the bank safe, but this journal and the old family Bible will stay with me. Katie is in college now, full of dreams about her future in the church. But something tells me her path will be different than what she imagines. If you're reading this, my dearest daughter, know that every step you've taken, even the ones that led you far away were necessary. True faith isn't found in the walls of a church but in the heart that chooses to love, even after knowing pain. You will always be my little Katie, even when the world knows you by other names. Catherine closed the journal with trembling hands, tears falling freely. He knew, she whispered. Somehow he knew I would lose my way. And still he never lost faith in me. Thomas smiled gently. Your father understood a profound truth, that sometimes we need to lose ourselves to truly find who we are. Every decision you made, every wall you built, every success you achieved in the corporate world, none of it was in vain. God was preparing you for this moment. Jennifer shared her own insight, her soft voice carrying the wisdom of years spent observing life from the skies. In 15 years as a flight attendant, I've learned that sometimes we need to fly very high to see the bigger picture of our lives. Your father planted seeds of love that patiently waited for the right moment to bloom. The morning sun now poured strongly through the cafe windows, turning the floating dust into tiny golden specks of light. Catherine caught her reflection in the glass. A successful executive was still there, but her eyes had changed. The emptiness she had carried for so long was beginning to fill with something more precious than any material achievement. I need to make some calls, she said, picking up her phone with newfound determination. First, to the board of the old church. It's time to rebuild, not just a building but an entire legacy of love. And then, she hesitated for a moment, I need to call my team. All the projects we're working on for shopping malls and luxury condos, we're going to redirect them. We'll build community centers, low-cost clinics, spaces that truly make a difference in people's lives. As Catherine stepped away to make her calls, Thomas shared with Jennifer something he had held in his heart all these years. Robert Morrison told me one last thing before he went back inside the church that night. He said that sometimes God allows us to lose everything so we can discover what can never be lost: true love. The cafe maintained its steady rhythm around them, waitresses serving, customers coming and going, life continuing its ordinary course. But at that corner table, 3 lives intertwined by divine purpose bore witness to the unfolding of a timeless truth, that love, when true, has the power to transcend time, tragedy, and transformation. And sometimes, the longest way home is precisely the journey we need to become who we were always meant to be. The auditorium of the Boston School of Medicine glowed under the afternoon light streaming through the tall stained glass windows. Catherine Morrison sat in the front row, a seat her new friend Michael Anderson had reserved for her and Pastor Thomas. Her hand still held her father's journal, now an anchor connecting her not only to the past but also to a future full of possibilities. Jennifer, who had decided to stay and witness the conclusion of this extraordinary journey, took the seat beside Catherine. Her flight attendant uniform had been replaced by a simple dress, but her presence carried the same kindness that had helped transform a moment of conflict into a story of redemption. It's strange, Catherine whispered, adjusting the blazer that now felt too heavy for the occasion. I spent so much time measuring success by the value of the contracts I signed, and now I see that true wealth has always been in the things that money can't buy. Thomas smiled, his calloused hands holding the envelope containing the speech he had prepared for his son. You know, David chose to do his residency at the same public hospital where his mother worked as a nurse. When I asked him why, he said something your father used to say: the most beautiful miracles happen in the most unlikely places. The murmurs in the auditorium quieted as the first notes of the graduation march began to play. The graduates filed in, their white coats symbolizing not just medical knowledge but a commitment to healing and care. David Anderson walked with the same humility he had inherited from his father. His eyes found Thomas in the front row, and a smile lit up his face as he saw not only his father but also the people who had become part of this story in the past 24 hours. The dean of the school opened the ceremony with words about responsibility and vocation, but Catherine barely heard them. Her mind was on the pages of the journal she had read that morning, particularly an entry that seemed to speak directly to this moment. Dear Katie, when you find your true path, it won't be through the success the world values, but through the love that transforms lives. You have that gift, the same one I saw in your eyes when, as a little girl, you insisted on helping with the soup for the needy. That gift never died, it merely slept, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The ceremony progressed, and soon the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. David was called to the stage to receive his diploma, but there was something different about his expression. Thomas stood up, and Catherine noticed he was no longer wearing the simple shirt from the previous day. He now wore a white coat over his modest clothes. David Anderson, the dean announced, in addition to receiving his diploma today, has been chosen by his peers and professors to deliver the class speech. But first, his father, Pastor Thomas Anderson, has been invited to make a special presentation. Thomas walked up to the stage, his steps steady despite the simplicity of his attire. The entire auditorium fell silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. "My son," Thomas began, his voice clear and filled with emotion, "today, you receive more than a diploma. You receive this white coat that belonged to your mother, Sarah. She kept it for years, dreaming of the day her son would follow in her footsteps of care and compassion. On the nights she fought her battle with cancer, making this coat became her project of love and hope." David embraced his father, silent tears marking the moment as Thomas helped his son put on Sarah's coat. The entire auditorium rose in spontaneous applause, but it was David's next words that completely transformed the atmosphere. "Today," he said into the microphone, "we do not just celebrate an academic achievement. We celebrate the transformative power of love and humility. My father taught me that the most important garments we can wear are invisible to the eye. They are compassion, dedication, and love for others." Catherine felt her heart race as she recognized the words. They were almost identical to those her own father had written in his journal. Jennifer took her hand, offering silent support. "And for this reason," David continued, "I want to announce that, together with a few colleagues, we are creating a free clinic in the old neighborhood of the Church of Hope. A place where medical care will be provided with the same love and dedication I learned from my parents." Catherine couldn't hold back her tears. That was precisely the neighborhood where her father had served, where she had grown up, where this whole story had begun. Her hands trembled as she opened her bag and pulled out an envelope. When David finished his speech, Catherine approached the stage. Her walk, once marked by corporate authority, now carried a different grace, the grace of someone who had finally found their true purpose. "David," she said, her voice filled with deep emotion, "your project for the free clinic just received its first investment. Morrison Enterprises is redirecting its resources to projects that truly make a difference in people's lives. And we will start by rebuilding not only a clinic but the entire Church of Hope." The auditorium erupted in applause once again, but it was the tears in Thomas's eyes that said it all. He knew in that moment that the promise made to Pastor Robert 30 years ago had been more than fulfilled. It had blossomed into something even more beautiful. Jennifer, watching the scene from her seat, thought about how her grandmother always said that angels appear in the most unexpected moments. Sometimes wearing white coats, sometimes dressed in the simple clothes of a pastor, and sometimes even in expensive suits hiding hearts in need of healing. The ceremony continued, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The graduates were not just receiving diplomas, they were witnessing a lesson on how true love has the power to transform lives, heal old wounds, and create new beginnings. After the ceremony, as people gathered to celebrate, Catherine found a quiet moment to open the journal one last time. On the final page, in handwriting she now recognized as the voice of her father's love, she found words that seemed written especially for this moment. "The true miracle, my Katie, is not in never falling, but in how we choose to rise again. Every time you help someone stand back up, every time you choose love over judgment, every time you use your gifts to serve others, in those moments, you are building the true Church of Hope, one that no fire can destroy because it lives in the hearts of people." Catherine closed the journal, knowing she no longer needed it to find her way. Her father's legacy now lived through her own choices, through the lives she would touch with her newly discovered vocation. "Welcome home, Katie," Thomas said softly, using the nickname only her father used to call her. "Your father always knew this day would come." And so, in an auditorium filled with future doctors, a story of loss and redemption found its true purpose. The Church of Hope would be rebuilt, not just with bricks and mortar but in the hearts of every person touched by this story of love, humility, and transformation. Dear friends who have followed this journey to its conclusion, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that make us look within ourselves and rediscover our own capacity for transformation. If this narrative touched your heart, if you saw yourself in Catherine's journey, or found hope in Pastor Thomas's words, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Every story we share on the Life Stories channel is carefully chosen to inspire, move, and remind us of the transformative power of love and humility. If you'd like to continue this journey with us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your presence and reflections are invaluable to our community. Together, we can explore more stories that remind us of the beauty of human connection and the power of redemption. Until our next story, where once again, we'll dive into the depths of the human heart to uncover treasures of hope and transformation.